And yeah, I'll take it away. So a lot of good discussion today about intelligence. Enjoyed the previous presentations, especially the one about um, the change in executive protection, and a lot of discussion about getting good intelligence out there to them. So let me just start off by introducing myself. For those of you who don't know, my name is Matt Bradley. I'm the Vice President of Global Security Solutions for OnSolve. OnSolve is a critical event management company, a software company that has a platform for critical event management. I've been there a couple of months. I came from International SOS. I worked at International SOS for 6 years as the Regional Security Director of the Americas, providing intelligence and um, operational advice to all of our clients traveling in the Western Hemisphere. Before that, I lived 12 years overseas in Honduras, Argentina, and Chile. Part of that time in the private sector, and part of that time working for the CIA. So happy to be here with you, and happy to be a sponsor of this great forum and the opportunity to present here. So I'll get started. I want to set the scene by fast forwarding to Inauguration Day of 2021. This is a map of the parade route. This red area here is where the crowds will be. And let's say that there's a report of a fire near the Capital South Metro. And then shortly thereafter is a report of an explosion near the tidal basin. And finally, a report of a group of protesters forming up near Massachusetts Avenue. Vetted and validated risk intelligence will be critical to organizations who have employees and VIPs attending the inauguration. However, the information must arrive quickly and be able to distinguish that there are three separate events happening in proximity. So there'll be plenty of information on social media and from local authorities, but how do you turn that information into actionable intelligence? Well, that's what I hope to talk to you about today. So how do we know that companies need actionable intelligence? Well, mostly because they tell us. So this is a recent survey by crisis management firm CS&A International, and it revealed that the most difficult aspects to managing a crisis were communicating quickly, measuring the impact, understanding the scope and scale, and then reacting quickly. So reacting quickly requires timely alerts of the validated critical events without burying you in the noise of everything that's on the internet. So when we think about resiliency in 2021, which we hope that we will be fully recovering in 2021, not still reacting to the pandemic that we have. When we talk about it, the road to recovery is about speed, accuracy, and time. Okay, we've already talked about speed as it relates to alerting you about a critical event. We've talked about accuracy is about the confirmation of that event. And then of course, it's correlation to your own assets, right? Whether it's important to you, not just that it has happened. And then time is not about speed, but about response time. Okay. Knowing quickly is the first step. But then you must quickly activate your incident management plan and have the critical communications capability to execute your plan. I've been pondering this idea of the mean time to recovery, right? The MTTR, which is well known in the IT world. And I would suggest that we in the physical security world should begin to measure critical event management in a similar way. So what I mean is, we know that, there's an active shooter and there's a process that we have to go through. And we need to know how long until we get to that time of resolution. And we can think to ourselves, obviously, the mean time to resolution for an active shooter cannot be compared to the mean time to resolution for an event like a hurricane. But we can certainly compare our times against similar incidents. And in fact, a time of 45 minutes for an active shooter might be too long, whereas a mean time to recovery for a hurricane of 3 days might be very quick. So are you measuring mean time to recovery for your physical security critical events? Do you compare your times, and do you incorporate lessons learned to improve response time in the future? Let me give you an example. We had a leading consumer packaged goods company that created a multi-function COVID-19 response team, as probably many organizations did. This team was responsible for overseeing the production of goods for over a dozen manufacturing facilities throughout North America. When the pandemic hit, the team needed to assess the severity of COVID-19 outbreaks in the areas in which the company was operating. And they needed to get a better understanding of which areas would be shutting down so they could do capacity planning. This is all about business continuity. If they needed to shut down a facility, how could they shift some of that capacity to another facility with minimal impact? As many of you experienced, part of the problem was inconsistent reporting on COVID-19 cases, outbreaks, restrictions, and shutdowns. I know I was still at International SOS when it broke out in March, and we spent days, combing through different websites looking for all of the information about restrictions and shutdowns, and it was a very difficult process. So there was some state level reporting, but there were very few sources that had this hyper local or very granular data. So the ability to gather county, city, and sometimes even neighborhood data was key. For example, knowing about the capacity at local hospitals or testing sites, or restrictions and shutdowns in those areas, or quarantine. So how could the team possibly know which data sources to pay attention to and which ones were relevant? From global, national, local news, no one person could handle the influx of notifications, while also trying to manage the weather-related incidents, operational issues, and other critical events. The team needed an artificial intelligence solution that would provide geolocated alerts overlaid with the location of their facilities. With this artificial intelligence solution, the raw data was augmented. The team could then sift through the noise to quickly identify pandemic closures or project potential closures and operational disruption. So with this AI model for capacity planning, the company was able to shift raw materials and employees to other plants to help keep them open while keeping employees safe by not sending them to workplaces in the hardest hit areas. So again, a big data problem, but adding context to that data to augment that intelligence. Let me give you another example of the need for AI-enabled risk intelligence, right? This is a map of protest activity, recent protest activity in the United States. We've all been seeing these pop up. The breadth and depth of these protests indicates how difficult it is to cover them all with traditional analyst-produced intelligence. However, due to the possibility for misinformation or excessive noise, we need a better way to do AI-enabled risk intelligence. Why conventional AI risk intelligence is inadequate, right? So let me walk you through an example, and I'll use some common keywords. Shots fired, right? We're all familiar with those shots, and I'm using some examples that came from 2016 because these are examples that we know happened, right? So you have a couple of sources up here talking about shots fired at the Capitol and the warehouse and the White House being locked down. But then in that same string of tweets, you have a casting call for a student film called Shots Fired. So think about analysts having to work their way through all of these different reports to get to that, and then identify which ones are valid, weed out the noise. Here's another one, right? A bunch of people tweeting about shots fired, and then this really legitimate source called CBC News, which would be helpful for most people, right? So being able to separate between a validated source so that you can publish quickly and know that that's actually happened versus just having to go through all of this information. So here's another one, right? Oh my God, they're talking about the same event. These people are talking about the same event. Oh my God, shots fired in the White House. It wasn't the White House, it was the Capitol. Shots fired, but Beyonce's okay. Well, I'm so glad that Beyonce's okay, but it has nothing to do with this event, right? And this incident, and it's just noise that's filling up your screen if you're monitoring all of social media. All right, one more on shots fired. This was a different event. When I was at International SOS, again, this is from 2016 in the same time frame. I was at International SOS. We saw a tweet from a guy who was in the Atlanta airport, and it said, "I never ran so fast as when I heard the shots fired." Something did happen in Atlanta that day, but it wasn't shots fired. This happened the day after the Brussels airport attack. So obviously everyone was on high alerts. And these are actual tweets, and these all showed up when I searched. They all showed up in the same order. So your analysts or your operators would have to go through every one of these to be able to figure out which one was legitimate, right? And so a couple of legitimate sources up here, and then a couple of other people saying, it didn't happen. Here's another example of why source clustering. I'm going to talk about source clustering for a second. So why this makes a difference. So here's an example of, shots fired again. This time it's in Tulsa. 3 legitimate reports from, people that we would trust to give us this information. But, this turned out to be a false alarm, and maybe, it would be easier for your analysts, instead of having to go through all 3 of these alerts, that they got one alert with a summary of what had happened, right? Again, just trying to be more efficient so that you can speed up that time to response. Why do validated sources matter? Why would you want to have validated sources as opposed to looking at everything on the internet? So again, going back to the Capitol event, here are 5 Johnnies, right? So we're not sucking up all of the internet and trying to determine who is legitimate and who isn't, okay? The conventional method of AI-enabled risk intelligence generates lots of noise, which will slow down your response time, right? This string of tweets is an example of why we use validated sources instead of every tweet that's in the effort, right? As you can see, 5 guys named Johnny are tweeting about a shooting that happened in DC. This was the Capitol building shooting. The shooting did happen, but do you want your analysts or your operators scrolling through dozens of bot-produced tweets or alerts to get to the validated sources? Would you report this information based on these guys retweeting this? No, you probably wouldn't. Would you have to read through it or scroll through it to get to the ones that matter? Of course you would. Okay, I get it. A lot of talk about shots fired. Okay, I'm going to stop on the shots fired. Most of that you already knew, but I wanted to use shots fired because they are legitimate keywords, right? And the point is that we use those and we pay attention to those sources that do that. And this helps to define the challenges with traditional analyst produced intel, which is speed and volume, right? It's slower and it can't produce the same volume. And then the problems with conventional AI produced intelligence, which are noise and usability. So here's what I mean by that. So traditional analyst produced intel will follow a linear path, right? The incident happens. Most analysts are using software to monitor the internet for keywords. We did this at International SOS. We use a number of different software tools. Due to the limitations of only being able to read one thing at a time, your analyst could be slow to detect an incident. Once they detected an incident, then of course they want to validate with at least 2 sources. Then they have to draft. We would pass it to an editor, and then we would publish the alert. Okay. We have a high level of confidence in analyst produced intel because of this robust process, but it can slow your response time down. Now, conventional AI uses smart machines to replace humans, so it can read millions of pieces of data at the same time. However, because it is monitoring all of social media and the internet, it must have an algorithm for determining the veracity of the report. Many times the algorithm gets it right, but not always. So once it is verified, the report is published. And then when a second source comes in, it reports on the same incident, it follows the same process, and it sends another alert, and so on for additional sources. And then the analyst or the operator is left to piece together that the 3 alerts are talking about the same incident, and then also to summarize those. This takes time, which again slows down your response. So next generation AI uses tens of thousands of validated sources, because they're out there, so that when an incident is detected, it can be published at the same time because we already know that it comes from a trusted source, okay? And then when we cluster those sources together, because we know they're talking about the same incident in the same location, you get a dynamic situation report that summarizes what they've done. Okay, what does this look like in practice? Let me show you one of these alerts. Okay, this is an alert about a 7.8 magnitude quake that hit Alaska. That has relevance, obviously, for Alaska, but it also has relevance for the west coast of Canada and the United States because of the potential for tsunamis. So we detected and published this alert 10 minutes after it happened. Okay. Now, some people might say that was pretty slow for an earthquake, but the gold standard for earthquakes, as we all know, is the U.S. Geological Survey. And they reported this in 11 minutes, so 1 minute after we did. We had a total of 175 sources on this particular earthquake. Now, obviously, that's because you get the initial reports and then more reports are coming in afterwards. So think about whether you want to read all of those 175 alerts individually, or would you rather have one dynamic sitrep that's updated with new information. Now, the dynamic sitrep is not a compilation of everything that's in every one of those reports. It's adding, the AI knows that there's a difference between what they're reporting, and it's only adding in new information when it's verified, right? So ultimately, you as you're responsible for not just knowing that something happened, but you're responsible for then informing other people. And part of the job of the GSOC is to write up a sitrep. Tell us what happened. Tell us what you're doing about it. How much easier would it be for the GSOC if you had this actionable intelligence that produced a draft of the sitrep for you? Then obviously your GSOC would be able to put that in its own format and send it out to your key stakeholders. Again, this is all about shortening the response time. So when we think about what is it that makes intelligence actionable, we boil it down to 4 things, right? Coverage, accuracy, relevance, and speed. Coverage is, again, about monitoring thousands of sources, but then also about sending thousands of targeted alerts. Why should you not be afraid of sending thousands of alerts? Because they're targeted only to the people who are in those locations, whether we use an app to geolocate them or a distribution list that somebody provides, or we map those assets in an overlay of those facilities like we did in the case study, right? Accuracy, using validated sources to read the structured and unstructured data to increase the confidence in the accuracy of the information. Is it perfect? No. Is it better than trying to find, a needle in a haystack? Yes. In fact, when I compare what you're trying to do with conventional AI-enabled risk intelligence, I liken it to trying to find a needle in a field of haystacks, because the internet is so broad and there's so many potential sources out there. Whereas we are trying to find a needle in a stack of needles, right? And you look at the needle and you say, oh, well, is this an earthquake needle or a hurricane needle or a protest needle? They're all needles, right? And they're all valid. And so we just have to put them in the right buckets and send them to the right people much quicker. Relevance, sifting through the noise to produce the most relevant alerts and correlate them to your people and assets. Again, the information doesn't have any value to you. It's not actionable unless you can correlate it to your assets and your people. And then, of course, we talked about speed. Faster alerts lead to faster responses, which produce better outcomes. So before we finish, I want to emphasize that response is more than just risk intelligence, right? We're talking about access to risk intelligence, but risk intelligence tells you that something happened. It actually then puts you on the clock. So once you know something's happened, now you're responsible for managing that critical event. So having a speedy response with a very poor, or having a speedy risk intelligence that tells you something happened without having good incident management and critical communications to manage that incident would actually put you in a bad spot. And so you want to make sure you have all of those things. So here's the world that we live in, right? There are many critical and non-critical events, and they're happening all the time. At the same time, we've got our assets out there in motion, and when we become aware of an event, we ask ourselves one question: am I a spectator or a participant? Okay. And at the intersection of these events and your assets, it becomes a critical event. You become a participant and you must act. So questions that you ask yourself about your capabilities today, right? Can I quickly and accurately detect a critical event through all the noise? Who gets notified, right? Who takes action on it? How can we quickly react and collaborate together, right? These are things that we very rarely act on alone. And then do we mitigate or even manage the critical event efficiently, right? Again, trying to produce that better outcome. And so I will finish where I started, right? Actual intelligence is about reducing the mean time to recovery. The sooner you know, the sooner you can start your response. And the benefit of a prompt response is to reduce the negative impact on safety, reputation, and revenue. Finally, effective critical event management leads to better outcomes for your people, your assets, your organization, and ultimately for your career. Thanks, Phelan.
Thank you. No, awesome. A lot of food for thought, but also a lot of actionable takeaways. I think often on this subject we talk in the macro, and this is actually very, very actionable. We've got some comments and questions. I'm going to go from back to front. Helen says, but what room is there for the proactive Intel partner? So I suppose proactivity versus reactivity, adding value versus being asked for a particular topic. What do you think?
If we're talking about, are we talking about intelligence partner analysts? So I think there's a lot of, obviously there's tons of value in having somebody who's a proactive Intel partner. And I don't think that risk intelligence, AI produced risk intelligence is meant to replace analysts. It's actually meant to make analysts more efficient. In fact, this type of tool can be used by analysts themselves. I mean, I look at what my team was doing at International SOS and think, could we have been more efficient if we were using intel that we knew came from validated sources? We would still have a lot of alerts that we would have to process, and we would have to determine whether or not they met our threshold and were coordinated with our assets, and we needed to respond or write an alert. But we wouldn't have been weeding through all of this nonsense, right? So I think that there is a convergence or a collaboration between these next generation AI enabled risk intelligence tools and the analysts.
Awesome. No, I like that distinction. Also, in the comments, Deborah says, seems to agree with you. Technology and physical security equals converging. So we had that. Mike is saying verifying and filtering out noise and facts, not fake news or deep fakes. It gets tougher and tougher to sift. I picked up on that source clustering term. I really like that. False positives Mike is talking about. But yeah, no, I think this is very interesting. What would you do differently if you were dealing with a smaller corporate security, private actor versus an enterprise level, corporate security function? Would you provide the same type of threat intel, or is that a different kettle of fish?
No, that's a good question, Phelim. And the thing about next gen AI enabled risk intelligence is the configurability, right? So the smaller your operation, the more you are reducing it through the configuration, right? And that might be the impact radius around your assets. It might be the severity level. So if you're a small team, you're probably just going to say, we really only want to know or can only know about the most severe incidents. And they have to be very close to our facilities or our people, as opposed to a larger enterprise, which is saying, well, I'm really interested in this situational awareness about everything that's going on around me, even though it doesn't necessarily affect me specifically. So that's a lot easier to fine tune, but you have to have the high volume of alerts that can only be produced through AI risk intelligence, right? Once you have that high volume, you can filter it out. If you don't have the volume, you can't add anything to it. And I think, again, I go back to that map of all the protest activity. Think of, my own team trying to write alerts. We could not write alerts about every one of those individual protests, but certainly there were validated sources that were putting out information. AI-enabled risk intelligence would be giving you that local detail about what was happening in every one of those protests.
I like it, and yep, we have a good like of talk about protest threat intel in a number of our events. It seems to be a bit of a topic of the moment. So it's very timely. I like that. But yes, we are out of time. Matt, it's great to see you in this new capacity, and it's great to be supported by OnSolve. Where can people get in touch with you and OnSolve?
Yeah, they can go to onsolve.com. They can see some of the information that we have. They can sign up for a demo if that's what they want to do, or they can have somebody to contact them. I'm Matt.Bradley at onsolve.com, so I'm happy to. I brought a lot of contacts with me, but if anybody wants to email me, that's easy enough. Just get in touch with me and I'll get you to the right place. We're a small company. We take every client seriously. So, we'll get you fixed up.
Fantastic. Well, Well, thanks ever so much. I look forward to seeing you in the audience. And yeah, thanks for a great presentation.
Thank you.